The Georgia cold case from 2000 that shocked an entire community started with a mother's morning coffee growing cold on a kitchen table. Julie Ann McDonald never finished that cup on August morning in Walker County because by evening, the 8-year-old was found brutally murdered in her own home, leaving behind 2 children and a community frozen with fear. For 24 years, her killer walked free while families locked their doors, neighbors whispered suspicions, and investigators clung to a single strand of DNA evidence that seemed to lead nowhere. But advanced forensic genealogy finally cracked the silence. When authorities arrested Robert Keith Vass in May 2024, the news rippled through Walker County like lightning, shattering assumptions about trust, safety, and the faces behind small-town smiles. After nearly a quarter-century of darkness, Julie's family could finally see justice on the horizon. But what took so long to uncover this hidden truth? Before we get into the story, drop a comment with your country and the time right now. The morning sun filtered through sheer curtains in Julie Ann McDonald's kitchen, casting gentle patterns across the linoleum floor, where her children's toys lay scattered like colorful breadcrumbs. At 28, Julie moved through her daily routine with the practiced grace of motherhood, pouring coffee, buttering toast, calling upstairs for sleepy voices to hurry along. Her 2 children, still young enough to need their mother's gentle coaxing, would remember this morning differently than she imagined. They would remember it as the last normal moment of their lives. Julie had always been the steady center of their small world in Walker County, Georgia. Friends described her as warm and generous, the kind of woman who remembered birthdays and brought casseroles to grieving neighbors. She carried dreams of giving her children more than she'd had better opportunities, safer neighborhoods, college educations that might lift them beyond the struggle she knew too well. That August morning, those dreams still felt within reach. By evening, Julie Ann McDonald lay dead in her own home, sexually assaulted and murdered by someone who had shattered not just one family, but an entire community's sense of safety. The coffee mug sat abandoned on the kitchen counter, a ceramic witness to innocence lost forever. The yellow tape seemed too bright against the gray evening sky, too artificial for the quiet residential street where families had raised children and tended gardens for generations. Detective Sarah Winters had seen plenty of crime scenes, but something about this one, maybe the toys scattered on the front porch, maybe the children's drawings still taped to the refrigerator inside, made her stomach clench with a different kind of dread. Within hours of Julie's discovery, Walker County Sheriff's deputies had transformed the modest home into a fortress of investigation. Neighbors gathered on the street, clutching coffee mugs and whispering theories, their eyes wide with the kind of fear that changes everything. Mrs. Patterson from next door kept repeating that she'd heard nothing unusual, as if her words could somehow rewind time and give Julie a different ending. The first 48 hours would prove crucial, everyone knew. Statistics showed that cases solved quickly stayed solved, while those that lingered often turned cold. Detective Winters moved methodically through the house, cataloging evidence and fighting the growing certainty that whoever had done this had planned carefully, covered tracks skillfully. By the second day, local reporters had arrived, followed by television crews from Atlanta. The story had everything viewers craved: a beautiful young mother, mysterious circumstances, a community in shock. But beneath the media attention, a darker reality was taking hold. No witnesses had come forward. No obvious suspects had emerged. The killer had seemingly vanished into thin air, leaving behind only questions and a trail of biological evidence that would need to speak for Julie when human voices had failed her. The investigation was just beginning, but already, hope was starting to feel fragile. The funeral home had never hosted such a crowd. Cars lined every street for 3 blocks around, forcing mourners to walk past houses where neighbors stood on porches, some weeping openly, others just staring with the hollow eyes of people whose world had suddenly become unfamiliar and dangerous. Inside, Julie's parents sat in the front row, their backs rigid with grief and determination, flanked by her children who seemed too small for such enormous sorrow. The funeral program was simple: a black and white photograph of Julie smiling, the dates of her too short life, and a Bible verse about justice and mercy that her mother had chosen with trembling hands. Friends spoke about her kindness, her laughter, her devotion to her children. They talked about the casseroles she'd brought when babies were born, the rides she'd given to elderly neighbors, the way she'd always remembered names and birthdays and little details that made people feel seen. But underneath the eulogies lay unspoken questions that hung in the air like smoke. Who had done this? Why Julie? Were their own families safe? The killer could be anyone, a stranger passing through, someone they all knew and trusted, a shadow figure who had studied their routines and chosen his moment with predatory patience. As Julie's casket was lowered into the Georgia earth, her parents made a silent vow that would sustain them through the long years ahead. They would not let her be forgotten. They would not let her case disappear into the files of unsolved crimes. They would fight for answers, for justice, for the truth that Julie deserved but would never live to see. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation Crime Lab was a temple of scientific precision where evidence was cataloged, analyzed, and stored with the reverence of sacred relics. Julie McDonald's case generated multiple evidence files, each labeled with numbers and dates that would outlive most of the investigators who handled them. The most important vial contained biological samples that held the key to justice if science could find a way to unlock it. In 2000, DNA testing was still relatively new in criminal investigations. The Combined DNA Index System, or CODIS, had been operational for only a few years, and its database contained far fewer profiles than it would in decades to come. When Julie's evidence was processed and run through the system, it generated a profile but no matches. The killer's DNA was there, captured and preserved, but his identity remained a mystery. Crime lab technician Maria Rodriguez handled the evidence with the kind of careful attention that came from knowing each vial represented someone's daughter, mother, sister. She'd processed hundreds of cases over the years, but Julie stuck with her. Maybe it was the age of the victim, maybe the brutality of the crime, or maybe just the way the case seemed to haunt everyone who touched it. The evidence vials went into controlled storage, where temperature and humidity were monitored around the clock. In the climate-controlled darkness, Julie's DNA waited patiently for science to catch up, for databases to grow larger, for technology to become more sophisticated. It would be a long wait, longer than anyone could have imagined, but the evidence would remain stable, uncorrupted, ready for the day when it could finally speak for the dead. The interview room at the Walker County Sheriff's Office saw a parade of faces in the weeks following Julie's murder. Detectives questioned everyone who had known her, however slightly: neighbors, co-workers, casual acquaintances, anyone who might have crossed paths with her in the days before her death. The transcripts filled 3 thick binders, hundreds of pages of questions and answers that painted a picture of a woman beloved by many but threatened by none. Robert Keith Vass appeared in those early files, though not prominently. A local resident with loose connections to the area, he answered questions politely, claimed no close relationship with Julie, and provided what seemed like a reasonable account of his whereabouts. His name was noted, his address recorded, his story filed away with dozens of others. In 2000, he was just another face in the crowd of potential witnesses, unremarkable and easily forgotten. The transcripts revealed the frustration of investigators grasping for leads that evaporated under scrutiny. A suspicious ex-boyfriend had an airtight alibi. A strange neighbor who'd made women uncomfortable turned out to be harmless. A drifter who'd been spotted in the area had moved on long before the crime occurred. Each interview raised hopes that were quickly dashed, each potential suspect eliminated through careful verification of alibis and evidence. Detective Winters read and reread the transcripts, searching for patterns, connections, anything that might have been missed in the initial rush of investigation. But the pages offered no revelation, no breakthrough moment when guilt was suddenly exposed. They were simply a record of a community trying to make sense of senseless violence, a catalog of dead ends that would haunt the case for decades. By the end of 2000, Julie McDonald's case file had grown to fill an entire storage box: crime scene photographs, witness statements, evidence logs, and investigation reports that documented 4 months of intensive work with little to show for it. The box joined hundreds of others in the climate-controlled evidence storage facility, a warehouse of unsolved cases that told the story of crimes without conclusions. Detective Winters made one final entry in the case log before turning her attention to newer investigations that demanded immediate action. She wrote about the DNA evidence in storage, the witnesses who had been interviewed and cleared, the leads that had been pursued to their frustrating ends. Her final sentence was both a promise and an admission of defeat: investigation ongoing, pending new evidence or witnesses. The case wasn't officially closed cases like Julie's never were, technically, but resources had to be allocated to crimes that showed more promise of resolution. New murders, fresh evidence, active leads, all took priority over the cold file that offered no obvious path forward. The box would remain accessible, waiting for the phone call or tip or scientific breakthrough that might resurrect the investigation. Julie's parents visited the sheriff's office monthly at first, then quarterly, then twice a year, asking about progress and demanding that their daughter's case not be forgotten. Each time, they were told the same thing: the evidence was preserved, the case remained open, and if anything new developed, they would be the first to know. The words were sincere but offered little comfort to a family watching justice slip away one day at a time. The weeks following Julie's murder transformed Walker County from a place where people left doors unlocked and windows open to a community of deadbolts, security systems, and constant vigilance. Hardware stores sold out of door chains and window locks. Neighbors who had never exchanged more than casual waves began organizing informal watch groups, noting unfamiliar cars and tracking the movements of strangers. The McDonald family street became a daily reminder of vulnerability. Every house now sported new locks, porch lights that burned all night, and curtains drawn tight against the darkness that had claimed Julie. Children who had once played freely in front yards were now kept close to home, their parents' eyes constantly scanning for threats that might emerge from anywhere. Mrs. Patterson, Julie's next-door neighbor, installed a security system that beeped every time a door or window opened. She'd wake at night to the sound of cars passing too slowly, her heart racing as she peered through blinds to see if danger was returning to her street. Sleep became elusive for many residents, their dreams haunted by questions about the killer who remained free among them. The new locks were more than security measures, they were symbols of how profoundly Julie's murder had changed everyone's sense of safety and trust. What had once been a community where neighbors borrowed sugar and children rode bikes until dark had become a place where suspicion lurked behind every smile and fear followed every shadow. The killer had not just taken Julie's life, he had stolen an entire community's innocence, leaving behind a legacy of locks and lights that would endure long after his name was forgotten. The first anniversary of Julie's death arrived with the weight of unfinished business. Her parents organized a memorial service at the small Baptist church where Julie had been baptized as a child, married her first husband, and brought her children for Sunday services. The church was packed with faces marked by a year of living with unanswered questions and unrequited grief. Pastor Williams spoke about faith in dark times and the promise that justice would eventually prevail, even if not in the time frame human hearts demanded. He lit a memorial candle for Julie, its flame small but steady in the sanctuary where she had once sung in the choir. The light seemed fragile against the darkness that had settled over her case, but it burned without wavering, as if fed by something stronger than wax and wick. Outside the church, Detective Winters met with reporters who had returned to mark the anniversary. She had little news to share. The investigation remained active, the evidence secure, the leads exhausted. "We haven't forgotten Julie," she told the cameras, "and we won't stop working until we find who did this." The words felt hollow even as she spoke them, worn smooth by repetition over the long months of failure. After the service, Julie's children stood beside her grave, older now and more aware of what they had lost. They had learned to live with questions that had no answers, with a hole in their lives that would never be filled. The memorial candle from the church would burn for days, its light visible through the window like a beacon calling justice home to a case that seemed destined to remain forever cold. The early 2000s brought a parade of school photos that documented Julie's children growing up in the shadow of her absence. Each year, their grandmother would carefully arrange the pictures on the mantelpiece: kindergarten gaps where front teeth should be, elementary school smiles that seemed forced, middle school expressions that had learned to mask the deeper questions about identity and loss. The children were being raised with love by extended family, but no amount of care could fill the specific shape of a mother's absence. Detective Winters had retired in 2003, passing Julie's case to Detective Marcus Thompson, who inherited not just files but the weight of a community's frustrated hopes. He reviewed the evidence regularly, re-interviewed key witnesses when time allowed, and followed up on the occasional tip that filtered in from people who claimed to remember something important from that August night in 2000. Nothing ever led anywhere significant. The children, now approaching their teenage years, had constructed lives around a missing piece. They attended school, played sports, made friends, and achieved the small victories that mark normal childhood, but always with the awareness that their mother's killer remained free. Family gatherings became informal strategy sessions, where relatives discussed new investigative techniques they'd heard about on television or read about in magazines. Julie's parents aged visibly during these years, carrying the dual burden of raising grandchildren and demanding justice for their daughter. They clipped newspaper articles about other cold cases being solved, filed away information about DNA advances, and maintained correspondence with victims' rights groups who offered support and advice. The case had become not just a quest for justice, but a full-time mission that defined their lives and shaped their children's understanding of right and wrong. By 2010, the 10th anniversary vigil for Julie McDonald drew a smaller crowd than in previous years. The weathered poster that had been used each year, "Justice for Julie, Someone Knows Something," showed signs of wear and repeated use, its edges frayed but its message undimmed. The same core group of family and friends gathered each August, their faces older but their determination unchanged. Detective Thompson, now the senior investigator on the case, spoke to the gathered crowd about advances in forensic science and the possibility that new technology might someday unlock the evidence that had waited so patiently for a decade. He mentioned other cold cases being solved through improvements in DNA analysis and database searches, though he was careful not to make promises he couldn't keep. The vigil had become as much about community memory as individual justice. Julie's story had become part of Walker County's collective narrative, a reminder that evil could strike anywhere and that vigilance was the price of safety. Parents still told their teenagers about Julie when explaining why they needed to be careful, why doors should be locked, why trust had to be earned rather than freely given. Julie's children, now in high school, participated in the vigil with a maturity beyond their years. They had learned to speak publicly about their mother's case, to thank supporters, and to maintain hope even when hope seemed foolish. They carried themselves with the dignity of young people who had been forced to grow up too quickly but had chosen grace over bitterness, determination over despair. The weathered vigil sign would be stored carefully after each anniversary, kept safe against another year of waiting, another year of unanswered questions, another year of believing that justice delayed was not justice denied. Detective Lisa Chen received her assignment to the Cold Case Unit in 2011 with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. Cold cases represented both opportunity and frustration, the chance to solve mysteries that had defeated previous investigators, but also the likelihood of inheriting cases that resisted every attempt at resolution. Julie McDonald's file was among the first she reviewed, and something about the case immediately caught her attention. Maybe it was the thoroughness of the original investigation, the quality of the evidence that had been preserved, or simply the way Julie's family had refused to let her memory fade into bureaucratic obscurity. Chen read every report, studied every photograph, and traced every lead that had been pursued over the previous decade. She brought fresh eyes to old evidence, looking for patterns or connections that earlier investigators might have missed. The 2010s brought significant advances in DNA technology and database management. What had been impossible in 2000 was now routine, and Chen began the process of having Julie's evidence retested with more sophisticated equipment. The results were encouraging. The DNA profile was cleaner and more complete than the original analysis had produced, but still generated no matches in CODIS or other criminal databases. Chen also began reaching out to other law enforcement agencies, sharing Julie's case information with investigators working similar crimes. The internet had made such collaboration easier, and she joined networks of detectives who specialized in sexual assault and murder cases. Perhaps Julie's killer had struck elsewhere. Perhaps there were patterns that could only be seen when cases were viewed together. It was detailed work that required patience, but Chen had learned that cold cases were solved by persistence as much as inspiration. The mid-2010s marked a revolution in forensic science that most Americans learned about through sensational headlines about cases being solved after decades. The Golden State Killer's capture in 2018 introduced the general public to investigative genetic genealogy, a technique that combined DNA analysis with family tree research to identify suspects through their relatives. For families like the McDonalds, it represented the first real hope they'd felt in years. Detective Chen had been following these developments closely, attending conferences and training sessions that prepared law enforcement for the new possibilities. The technique was complex and time-consuming, requiring DNA evidence to be uploaded to genealogy databases and analyzed by experts who could trace family relationships back through generations. It wasn't magic, but it was the closest thing to magic that forensic science had produced. Julie's case seemed ideal for genealogical analysis. The DNA evidence was high quality and substantial, and the original crime predated the massive expansion of DNA databases that had occurred in recent years. Chen began the process of having the evidence prepared for genealogical submission, a procedure that required approval from supervisors and careful documentation to ensure that any results would be admissible in court. The McDonald family watched these developments with cautious optimism. They had been disappointed too many times to allow themselves unguarded hope, but the news stories about other families finally getting answers after decades of waiting provided encouragement that their own ordeal might someday end. Julie's parents, now in their 70s, spoke openly about their fear that they might not live to see justice for their daughter, making the promise of new investigative techniques feel even more precious. The COVID-19 pandemic brought the world to a halt in early 2020, and with it came delays and complications that affected every aspect of law enforcement, including cold case investigations. Detective Chen found herself working from home for months, able to review files and conduct phone interviews, but unable to pursue the more active investigative work that cases like Julie's required. For the McDonald family, the pandemic added another layer of isolation to their already difficult situation. The extended family members who had helped raise Julie's children were now in high-risk categories, and the casual gatherings that had sustained them through years of grief became impossible. Even the annual memorial vigil had to be canceled, the first time in 20 years that Julie's death anniversary passed without a public commemoration. But the enforced stillness also provided opportunities for reflection and planning. Chen used the downtime to conduct an exhaustive review of Julie's case files, looking for details that might have been overlooked in the rush of active investigation. She reached out to the new genetic genealogy experts who had emerged as leaders in the field, laying groundwork for the analysis that would begin once laboratories reopened and normal operations resumed. Julie's children, now adults with children of their own, found themselves explaining their family history to a new generation. The pandemic had reminded everyone of life's fragility and the importance of justice and truth. As they helped their own children with remote schooling and weathered the uncertainty of the global crisis, they carried forward the same determination that had sustained their grandparents through 2 decades of waiting for answers about their mother's death. By 2021, as the world began to recover from the pandemic's initial shock, public interest in cold case investigations had reached new heights. Documentary series and podcasts about unsolved crimes commanded large audiences, and families across the country were organizing to demand renewed attention for cases that had been forgotten by overwhelmed law enforcement agencies. The McDonald family decided to add their voices to this movement. Julie's children, now confident adults who had learned to speak publicly about their family's ordeal, launched an online petition calling for renewed investigation into their mother's murder. They shared the petition through social media, local news outlets, and true crime forums that had developed devoted followings among people fascinated by unsolved mysteries. The response exceeded their expectations. Within weeks, the petition had gathered thousands of signatures from across Georgia and beyond. People shared their own stories of unsolved crimes in their families, expressed support for the McDonald family, and demanded that law enforcement agencies prioritize cases like Julie's that had the potential to be solved through new technology. Local politicians took notice, and media attention began to focus on Walker County's cold case policies. The petition also caught the attention of advocacy groups that specialized in supporting families of murder victims. These organizations provided resources, expertise, and political connections that the McDonald family had never accessed before. For the first time since the immediate aftermath of Julie's death, they felt the support of a broader community that understood their struggle and shared their commitment to finding answers. Detective Chen welcomed the renewed attention and the political support it generated for cold case investigations. The petition had given her supervisors the justification they needed to allocate additional resources to Julie's case and others that showed promise of resolution. In early 2022, Detective Chen received approval to submit Julie McDonald's DNA evidence for advanced genealogical analysis. The process required working with a private laboratory that specialized in forensic genealogy, a rapidly growing field that combined cutting-edge science with traditional investigative techniques. The evidence that had waited in storage for over 20 years was about to meet the most sophisticated analytical tools ever developed. The genetic genealogy process was painstaking and precise. Julie's DNA evidence was first analyzed to create a comprehensive genetic profile that could be compared to profiles in public genealogy databases. Unlike the criminal databases that had been searched repeatedly over the years, these genealogy databases contained millions of profiles from ordinary citizens who had submitted DNA samples to learn about their ancestry and family history. When Julie's case DNA was uploaded to the genealogy database, it immediately generated dozens of potential matches, distant cousins and relatives of whoever had left the biological evidence at the crime scene. Genetic genealogist Rebecca Martinez was assigned to Julie's case, and she began the complex process of building family trees that might lead to the identity of the perpetrator. Martinez's work required her to trace family lineages back through multiple generations, using census records, birth certificates, obituaries, and other historical documents to map relationships between people who shared genetic markers with the DNA from Julie's case. It was detective work of a different sort, requiring patience and attention to detail that could span weeks or months of careful research. For the McDonald family, this development represented the most significant progress in Julie's case since the original investigation. After 22 years of disappointment and dead ends, they were finally working with evidence analysis that had a proven track record of success. By late 2023, genetic genealogist Rebecca Martinez had constructed an elaborate family tree that traced several branches of a family whose DNA showed connections to the evidence from Julie's case. The chart looked like something from a sociology textbook, with dozens of names connected by lines indicating marriages, births, and relationships that stretched back to the early 1900s. Somewhere in this network of human connections was Julie McDonald's killer. Martinez's analysis had narrowed the suspect pool to a handful of men who were the right age and lived in the right area at the time of Julie's murder. Each potential suspect required careful investigation, background checks, current addresses, verification of alibis from 23 years earlier. Detective Chen worked methodically through the list, eliminating possibilities one by one. Robert Keith Vass emerged as the most promising suspect through a process of elimination and positive identification. He had lived in Walker County in 2000, had no solid alibi for the night of Julie's murder, and fit the general profile of the perpetrator that had been developed years earlier. More importantly, his family tree position in Martinez's genealogical analysis made him a highly likely source of the DNA evidence. The challenge now was obtaining a direct DNA sample from Vass for comparison with the evidence from Julie's case. Georgia law allowed police to collect DNA from discarded items like cigarettes or coffee cups, but the process had to be conducted carefully to ensure that any results would be admissible in court. Chen began surveillance of Vass, waiting for the right opportunity to collect a sample that could either confirm or eliminate him as a suspect. The family tree chart had become a roadmap to justice, a scientific pathway that led from biological evidence to human identity through the patient work of genealogical analysis. On January 15, 2024, Detective Chen received the phone call she had been hoping for since taking over Julie McDonald's case. The DNA sample collected from Robert Keith Vass showed a direct match to the evidence from the 2000 crime scene. After nearly 24 years of uncertainty, scientific analysis had provided definitive proof of the killer's identity. The match report was unambiguous. The probability that the DNA belonged to someone other than Vass was calculated at less than 1 in several billion. It was the kind of statistical certainty that could support a prosecution and convince a jury. Chen read the report 3 times before calling her supervisor, then the district attorney's office, then finally Julie's family with the news they had waited decades to hear. The laboratory had performed multiple confirmatory tests to ensure accuracy, comparing not just the primary DNA markers but also examining degradation patterns and other technical factors that might affect the reliability of the analysis. Every test confirmed the same conclusion. Robert Keith Vass had left biological evidence at the scene of Julie McDonald's murder. Chen felt a mixture of satisfaction and soberness as she reviewed the case files with fresh eyes, now knowing the identity of the perpetrator who had eluded investigation for so long. Vass had been interviewed in 2000 but had provided no information that raised suspicion. He had lived quietly in the community for years after the murder, maintaining the appearance of an ordinary citizen while carrying the secret of his crime. The DNA match report would become the cornerstone of the prosecution's case, the scientific foundation for charges that would finally bring Robert Keith Vass to account for what he had done to Julie McDonald and her family on that August night so many years ago. The arrest of Robert Keith Vass took place on a quiet Tuesday morning in May 2024, executed with the precision and care that comes from pursuing a suspect for nearly a quarter century. Detective Chen and a team of investigators approached Vass's home just after sunrise, when the neighborhood was still largely asleep and the risk of public disturbance was minimized. Vass answered his door in a bathrobe, his face showing the confusion of someone awakened earlier than expected. Chen identified herself and informed him that he was under arrest for the murder of Julie Ann McDonald. The handcuffs clicked shut around his wrists, with the same metallic sound that had concluded thousands of arrests. But these particular handcuffs carried the weight of 24 years of waiting, hoping, and demanding justice. Vass said little during the arrest, asking only if he could call an attorney. His calm demeanor struck Chen as either the behavior of an innocent man or the composure of someone who had been expecting this moment for years. Either way, the scientific evidence made his guilt clear, regardless of his emotional response. The news of the arrest spread through Walker County like wildfire, carried by phone calls, text messages, and social media posts that shared the information faster than any newspaper or television broadcast could manage. For many residents, Vass was a familiar face, someone they had seen at the grocery store, the post office, community events. The revelation that he had been living among them while carrying the secret of murder sent shockwaves through neighborhoods where he had been considered just another neighbor. The handcuffs that bound Vass represented more than physical restraint. They symbolized the long arm of justice finally reaching across decades to hold accountable someone who thought he had escaped consequences for his actions. Julie McDonald's children were at work when Detective Chen called with news that would reshape the rest of their lives. The conversation was brief and professional. Vass had been arrested, DNA evidence had confirmed his guilt, charges were being filed immediately. But beneath the procedural language lay the emotional weight of an ending that had seemed impossible just hours earlier. The children, now adults with their own families and responsibilities, had constructed their lives around an absence that could never be filled, and questions that had seemed destined to remain forever unanswered. Their mother's murder had shaped their understanding of justice, safety, and the reliability of institutions that were supposed to protect innocent people. The phone call from Detective Chen represented not just the solution to a crime, but the validation of their family's faith in the possibility of truth. They called their grandparents immediately, voices breaking as they shared news that seemed too good to believe. Julie's parents, now in their 80s, had lived with the fear that they might die before seeing justice for their daughter. The phone call gave them something they had not dared hope, for the certainty that Julie's killer would face judgment for his actions. Within hours, the extended family had gathered at the grandparents' house, the same home where they had sought comfort in the immediate aftermath of Julie's death. But this gathering had a different quality, not celebration, because the years of loss could never be recovered, but a quiet satisfaction that truth had finally prevailed over silence, that persistence had overcome indifference, that justice had proven stronger than time. The phone call had lasted less than 5 minutes, but it marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another in a story that had defined their family for nearly a quarter of a century. The news of Robert Keith Vass's arrest reached Walker County's faith communities within hours, and by evening, several churches had scheduled special services to mark the moment and remember Julie McDonald's life. The Baptist church where Julie had been a member rang its bell continuously for 10 minutes, a sound that carried across the community like a call to prayer and reflection. Pastor Williams, now elderly but still ministering to the congregation that had supported Julie's family through decades of uncertainty, planned a service that would balance thanksgiving for justice with acknowledgement of the pain that could never be fully healed. He had counseled Julie's family through their darkest moments and had preached countless sermons about faith in the face of unanswered questions. Now he faced the challenge of helping his congregation understand how to respond when prayers were finally answered. The church sanctuary filled with familiar faces, people who had attended Julie's funeral, participated in memorial vigils, and maintained their commitment to her family's quest for justice. Many wept openly as the bell continued to ring, its bronze voice carrying both celebration and mourning across the hills of North Georgia. Julie's children attended the evening service, standing before a congregation that had watched them grow up in the shadow of tragedy. They spoke briefly about their gratitude for the community's support and their hope that their mother could finally rest in peace. The church bell that had called the faithful to worship for generations had become, for one night, a voice of vindication, calling a community to witness the power of persistent faith. The bell's sound would echo in the memories of everyone who heard it, marking the moment when 24 years of waiting finally yielded the justice that Julie McDonald deserved. The legal machinery that would bring Robert Keith Vass to trial began moving with the methodical precision that characterizes the American justice system at its best. District Attorney Rebecca Martinez, not to be confused with the genetic genealogist who had helped identify Vass, filed formal charges of murder and sexual assault, crimes that carried the possibility of life imprisonment or even the death penalty under Georgia law. Vass's arraignment was scheduled for early June, giving his attorney time to review the evidence and prepare a defense strategy. The DNA evidence seemed overwhelming, but defense attorneys in such cases often challenge the chain of custody, the reliability of genetic testing, or the procedures used to collect comparison samples. Martinez and her prosecution team began preparing for every possible line of attack. The court summons that Vass received in his jail cell was a simple document, printed on official letterhead and containing the basic information about his charges and court appearances. But the summons represented something larger, the formal beginning of the legal process that would determine his fate and provide the McDonald family with the resolution they had sought for nearly a quarter century. Julie's family met with prosecutors to discuss the trial timeline and their role as witnesses and victims' representatives. They would have the opportunity to provide victim impact statements if Vass was convicted, a chance to speak directly about how his actions had affected their lives and their community. The legal process would be long and sometimes difficult, but it represented the culmination of their decades-long quest for accountability. The court summons had set in motion a process that would test the strength of the evidence, the skill of the attorneys, and the ability of the justice system to provide closure for a family that had waited too long for answers. The arrest of Robert Keith Vass attracted media attention from across Georgia and beyond, as reporters recognized the significance of a cold case solved after nearly a quarter century through advanced DNA analysis. Detective Chen found herself fielding interview requests from television stations, newspapers, and podcasts that specialized in true crime content. For the first time since the original investigation, she could speak openly about evidence and procedures that had been kept confidential during the active investigation. Julie's family, who had spent years pleading for media attention that might generate new leads, now found themselves in the unusual position of having more interview requests than they could accommodate. They chose their appearances carefully, speaking to outlets that would treat Julie's story with respect and accuracy rather than sensationalism. Their goal was not fame, but education, helping other families understand the importance of persistence and the potential of new forensic technologies. The genetic genealogist Rebecca Martinez also became a media figure, explaining the science behind investigative genealogy in terms that general audiences could understand. Her interviews helped demystify a process that seemed almost magical to people unfamiliar with the intersection of genetics and traditional detective work. She emphasized that Julie's case represented just one success among many and that thousands of other cold cases might be solved through similar techniques. The media coverage served multiple purposes beyond simple news reporting. It educated the public about advances in forensic science, provided hope to other families dealing with unsolved crimes, and demonstrated that justice systems could adapt and improve over time. Most importantly, it ensured that Julie McDonald's story would be remembered not just as a tragedy, but as a testament to the power of persistence and the possibility of redemption through truth. District Attorney Rebecca Martinez assembled a prosecution team that understood the unique challenges of trying a case based on evidence collected 24 years earlier. The DNA analysis was strong, but successful prosecution would require careful presentation of complex scientific concepts to jurors who might have limited understanding of genetic genealogy and forensic procedures. The prosecutor's file grew to include hundreds of pages of documentation, crime scene reports, laboratory analyses, genealogical charts, and expert witness testimonies that would support the state's case against Robert Keith Vass. Martinez worked closely with the scientists who had developed the DNA match, ensuring that she could explain their procedures clearly and address any challenges that the defense might raise about the reliability of the evidence. Expert witnesses would be crucial to the prosecution's success. The genetic genealogist who had traced the family tree leading to Vass would need to explain her methodology in terms that jurors could follow and trust. Laboratory technicians would testify about the procedures used to analyze DNA evidence and the statistical probability that the samples matched Vass's genetic profile. Detective Chen would walk the jury through the investigation timeline and explain how new technology had finally provided the breakthrough that earlier investigators had sought. The defense team, led by attorney Michael Foster, prepared their own file challenging various aspects of the prosecution's case. They would argue that genetic genealogy was still a relatively new technique that might contain unknown sources of error. They questioned whether DNA evidence collected in 2000 could remain reliable after nearly a quarter century in storage. Most significantly, they prepared to argue that the match, while statistically strong, might not be sufficient to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. As the trial of Robert Keith Vass approached, Julie McDonald's family selected a photograph that would represent her throughout the legal proceedings. They chose a picture from Happier Times Julie, smiling in her kitchen, sunlight streaming through the window where she had prepared countless meals for her children. It was the image of a life cut short, a future stolen, dreams interrupted by violence that had seemed to go unpunished for too long. The photograph would sit on the prosecution's table throughout the trial, a constant reminder to jurors of the human cost of the defendant's alleged actions. It showed Julie as she had been in life, young, hopeful, devoted to her family, unaware that her time was running short. The smile in the photograph seemed to promise that truth would eventually prevail, that justice would find its way through the maze of years and evidence to hold her killer accountable. Julie's children looked at the photograph with mixed emotions as they prepared for the trial that would finally bring their mother's case to conclusion. They could see themselves in her features, could remember that smile from their earliest memories, could almost hear her voice calling them to breakfast or reminding them about homework or telling them how much she loved them. The photograph represented both loss and hope, the terrible absence that had shaped their lives, but also the possibility that their mother's story would end with justice rather than mystery. The trial would determine Robert Keith Vass's fate, but the photograph ensured that Julie McDonald would remain present throughout the proceedings, her memory demanding accountability from the man who had destroyed so many lives on that August night in 2000. Her smile seemed to promise that light would ultimately overcome darkness, that truth would prevail over silence, that justice would honor the innocent by holding the guilty responsible for their actions.